At his inauguration as President of the United States in January 1961, John F. Kennedy said,
"So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof."
From the White House in Washington on June 6, 1961, President Kennedy spoke to the American people.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. I returned this morning from a week-long trip to Europe, and I want to report to you on that trip in full. It was, in every sense, an unforgettable experience.
The presidential plane landed at Orly Airport in Paris. President Charles de Gaulle greeted the American chief executive. Mr. Kennedy described the purpose of his journey to Europe in these words. Two aims of American foreign policy above all others were the reason for the trip. The unity of the free world, whose strength is the security of us all, and the eventual achievement of a lasting peace. President Kennedy described the conversations he held with the French leader during his three-day stay in Paris. My talks with General de Gaulle were profoundly encouraging to me. Certain differences in our attitude on one or another problem became insignificant in view of our common commitment to defend freedom. Madame de Gaulle, Mrs. Kennedy, French government leaders, and heads of diplomatic missions gathered in the reception room of the airport. The U.S. Ambassador to France, James Gavin, introduced the members of the welcoming party to the American president. There was a special greeting for the president's sister-in-law. Mr. Kennedy was officially welcomed to France by President de Gaulle.
Monsieur le Président, à votre arrivée sur cette terre française.
Mr. President, upon your arrival on French land, which never saw Americans but as friends and allies, it is with great joy that I address to you and to the United States the most cordial greetings of France.
Très cordial salut de la France.
President Kennedy replied,
I want to express on behalf of my wife and myself our most generous appreciation of your welcome today. I come from America, the daughter of Europe, to France, which is America's oldest friend.
Escorted by the Garde Républicaine, the two presidents drove into the heart of Paris. It was a ceremonial prelude to hours of earnest consultation between the two leaders. Mr. Kennedy described the nature of these talks.
I found General de Gaulle far more interested in our frankly stating our position, whether or not it was his own, than in appearing to agree with him when we do not.
About his meetings with President de Gaulle, Mr. Kennedy went on to say, in our agreement on defending Berlin, on working to improve the defenses of Europe, on aiding the economic and political independence of the underdeveloped world, including Latin America, on spurring European economic unity, on concluding successfully the conference at Laos, and on closer consultations and solidarity in the Western Alliance, General de Gaulle could not have been more cordial. The world press noted the cordiality of the meetings between the first families of France and the United States. Visitors from all over the world succumbed to the classic beauty and the perennial charm of Paris. Saluted by the historic Garde Républicaine, Mr. Kennedy, with Secretary of State Dean Rusk, went to the Palais de Chaillot, escorted by Robert Saint-Jean, president of the Diplomatic Press Association. Mr. Kennedy came to address a luncheon of 400 newsmen. To them, he spoke of the problems we face to secure a lasting peace.
We must, in short, be constantly strengthening all of our forces, of all kinds, at all levels, deterring war and keeping the peace by making certain that those who would oppose us know that we are determined to resist aggression, whatever its force, and whatever kind of force is needed to resist it. The cause of freedom is under pressure all over the world, but because of the extraordinary rebirth of Western European strength, the struggle has been switched to other areas. The time has now come for us to associate more closely together than ever in the past in a massive and concerted attack on poverty, injustice, and oppression which overshadow so much of the globe.
In the stately rooms of the Quai d'Orsay, adorned with tapestries that are among the artistic treasures of France, President Kennedy, with Ambassador Gavin at his side, was host at a diplomatic reception. Many guests were from nations that have become independent in recent years. Stressing our obligations to one another in the fight for freedom and economic progress, Mr. Kennedy said in one of his speeches in Paris, "We are not spectators today. We are all contributing. We are all involved. Wherever it is our responsibility to make a maximum contribution." At NATO headquarters, President Kennedy explained why he believes history is moving in the direction of democracy.
There is no doubt that in our time we will see different groups assume positions of responsibility within each state. Different groups assume power. But the whole experience of the last years has shown the desire of people to be free and independent, to maintain their national sovereignty and independence. And I believe that when our times come to be recorded, this will be noted as the outstanding fact. This serves us because that is our ambition. Even the experience of those countries behind the Iron Curtain in their own relations show a strong desire to be free and independent.
Paris in the spring of 1961, at the time of President Kennedy's visit, was as beautiful as ever. Reporting on the atmosphere he found in France, President Kennedy said, "The French people as a whole showed vitality and energy which were both impressive and gratifying. Their recovery from the post-war period is dramatic." President Kennedy had this evidence of economic rebirth in mind when he said, "In many ways, the experience of Europe in the last 10 years has confounded all of those who believed that the tide of history was running against us." The city of Paris lived up to its reputation for tradition and pageantry in its civic reception for the American visitors. The ride to the Hôtel de Ville was one of the highlights of President Kennedy's 3-day stay in Paris. With Mrs. Kennedy, who proved immensely popular with all Parisians, the American chief executive came to City Hall to be greeted by the president of the Municipal Council, Mr. Julien Tardieu. Mr. Kennedy recalled that his 2 grandfathers had served on the City Council of the city of Boston. He pointed out that in the everyday workings of democracy, it is the City Council that is the closest to the people. After addressing the council, President and Mrs. Kennedy mingled with the Parisians who had gathered to express their welcome. Speaking of the people of Paris, in his report to the American nation, President Kennedy said, "They were heartwarming in their hospitality. and their graciousness to my wife is particularly appreciated. While her husband conferred with President de Gaulle, Mrs. Kennedy, escorted by Madame de Gaulle, visited a child care center and some of the historic landmarks and art museums of Paris. And so, after 3 days, the visit to Paris came to an end. French Prime Minister Michel Debré and Foreign Minister Maurice Couve de Morville bade President and Mrs. Kennedy farewell. The next stop was to be Vienna, capital of Austria. Summing up his feeling of satisfaction at the meetings he had had in Paris, President Kennedy said, "I left Paris for Vienna with increased confidence in Western unity and strength." The site of Vienna in the spring of 1961 is that of an historic city fully recovered from the ravages of World War II. The capital of Austria, whose independence and neutrality was guaranteed by the great powers in the Austrian State Treaty of 1955. Now, in the spring of 1961, Vienna offered its hospitality for a personal meeting between two world leaders against a background of historic landmarks. This was the scene at Vienna's airport when President Kennedy's plane arrived on the morning of Saturday, June 3rd. The world, beset by problems of Berlin and Laos, nuclear testing and disarmament, looked to Vienna as the President of the United States arrived, greeted by Austrian President Adolf Scherff and Chancellor Alphonse Gorbach. President Kennedy himself described his mission to Vienna.
I went to Vienna to meet the leader of the Soviet Union, Mr. Khrushchev. For 2 days, we met in sober, intensive conversation. Mr. Khrushchev and I had a very full and frank exchange of views on the major issues that now divide our two countries. I wanted to present our views to him directly, precisely, realistically, and with an opportunity for discussion and clarification. This was done.
As President Kennedy said in his report, this was not a summit meeting, but rather an informal exchange of views and a way of keeping open the channels of communication between the United States and the Soviet Union. One topic of discussion was the serious situation in Laos, of increasing concern to the peoples of the world. By its actions, the Soviet Union would have to show whether it supported a satisfactory settlement in Laos, where communist-backed factions were continuing hostilities against the royal government. President Kennedy reported a measure of agreement in Vienna.
Both sides endorsed the concept of a neutral and independent Laos, much in the manner of Burma or Cambodia. And of critical importance to the current conference on Laos in Geneva, both sides recognized the importance of an effective ceasefire.
The second meeting was held at the Soviet embassy. President Kennedy expressed America's desire for effective nuclear test controls and a disarmament agreement. Mr. Khrushchev's insistence on a Soviet veto over controls and on having disarmament precede inspection led Mr. Kennedy to express his disappointment.
In short, our hopes for an end to nuclear tests, for an end to the spread of nuclear weapons, and for some slowing down of the arms race have been struck a serious blow. But our most somber talks were on the subject of Germany and Berlin. I made it clear to Mr. Khrushchev that the security of Western Europe, and therefore our own security, are deeply involved in our presence and our access rights to West Berlin. But those rights are based on law, not on sufferance, and that we are determined to maintain those rights at any risk, and thus meet our obligation to the people of West Berlin and their right to choose their own future.
President Kennedy himself drew the balance of his 2-day meeting with Chairman Khrushchev.
I will tell you now that it was a very sober 2 days.
There was no discourtesy, no loss of tempers, no threats or ultimatums by either side. No advantage or concession was either gained or given. No major decision was either planned or taken. No spectacular progress was either achieved or pretended.
London was the last stop on the president's journey. Here, Mr. Kennedy recalled that from England, where the Mother of Parliaments stands as a vital symbol of representative government, had come many of America's most cherished traditions. A detachment of the Royal Navy rendered the honors as the president's plane arrived at London Airport. President Kennedy had come to consult with Britain's Prime Minister Macmillan on the result of his talks with Chairman Khrushchev, while U.S. Secretary of State Rusk went to confer with President de Gaulle and other Allied leaders. On his arrival in London, the President of the United States was greeted by the Lord Chamberlain, the Earl of Scarborough, representing Queen Elizabeth. After shaking hands with Prime Minister Macmillan, Mr. Kennedy expressed his pleasure at being in London.
I'm especially glad, Prime Minister, to have an opportunity to counsel with you. And I must say that I consider it to be a fitting climax to a journey which has taken us from Washington to Paris, to Vienna, and to London.
Kennedy's visit to London was also of a private nature. President Kennedy was to serve the next day as the godfather at the christening of his niece. At Admiralty House, temporary residence of Britain's Prime Minister, while 10 Downing Street is being renovated, Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Macmillan met for 4 hours. Their communique indicated their joint view that Soviet willingness to negotiate on Laos should be a test of Moscow's global intentions. It also noted agreement on the necessity of maintaining the rights and obligations of the Allied governments in Berlin. The British Prime Minister and Lady Dorothy Macmillan were hosts at a luncheon for President and Mrs. Kennedy. The warm hospitality of the British leader and Lady Macmillan spoke eloquently of the close ties of friendship and understanding that have so long united Britain and the United States. The continuity of British history is seen in London as the Guard changes at Buckingham Palace, part of the ritual and colorful pageantry that surrounds a royal family secure in the affections of the British people, an ever fascinating sight for all visitors to London. In the afternoon of Monday, June 5th, the crowds gathered to watch the arrival of President and Mrs. Kennedy, the first time a U.S. president was to call at Buckingham Palace since President Woodrow Wilson came here in December 1918. The crowd surged forward for a look at President and Mrs. Kennedy as they arrived for a private dinner at the palace with Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Later that evening, still in the formal clothes he wore for the dinner at Buckingham Palace, Prime Minister Macmillan accompanied President Kennedy to the airport. U.S. Ambassador to London, David Bruce, was the last to shake hands with the President, who was now on his way back to Washington. For Mr. Kennedy, it had been a long journey. It had been part of the task he had set for himself on becoming President of the United States, to begin anew the search for peace. The presidential plane left London at midnight. The next day, from the White House, President Kennedy summed up the significance of his Vienna talks with Chairman Khrushchev.
The somber mood that they conveyed was not cause for elation or relaxation, nor was it cause for undue pessimism or fear. It simply demonstrated how much work we in the free world have to do, and how long and hard a struggle must be our fate as Americans in this generation as the chief defenders of the cause of liberty.